Hello, this is John Alexis Guerra Gomez, Web Development Northeastern Week 3, and this is the class for JavaScript. I'm remaking this video because it seems the previous version was wrong. So, what I was saying in this part is that we have the introduction, and if you take a look at the previous version of the slides, I had a very small set of slides, and then I usually liked asking people to just go and take a look at the documentation of JavaScript on MDN because they have so many resources and so many options in there that you can just go and find what are the things that will be more helpful for you. However, since we have AI, I did try an experiment on just asking Cloud AI, and this was specifically using GitHub Copilot because since my slides are with Reveal.js, this applies very well and is very easy to do. I can go and ask it Cloud just to go and check on this guide and to create like a small 20-minute presentation for my students. And I think it did a great job. So let me walk you by that. So hopefully this time the slides will not froze. So at the beginning, like it's just a description of what JavaScript is, and it's a very interesting language. It's high level. It's interpreted. It was created for the web in 1995. However, right now you can make it and work in everything from clients, of course, on the browser to servers and mobile and even desktop. Things like VS Code and uh, Slack, two technologies that we use in the class, are actually created using JavaScript. So you can see the power of it. And I want to say it's the most used language in the world because basically, whenever you have a web browser, you will have JavaScript running. So at the end of the day, JavaScript kind of became like the what Java wanted to be when it was created, which is like a programming language that you can use everywhere. Okay, so it's also dynamic, which I really like, and weakly typed if you want like an option that is more structured than TypeScript. If you're coming from something like Java, this could be like a better option for you. However, for me, I really like it because you can just, as long as you code in a very careful way and you are aware that it is so dynamic, then you can achieve very interesting things. So terms of that, the other thing you need to know is that there is a big difference between JavaScript and something called ECMAScript. So the whole idea of ECMAScript is that it's a consortium, it's a specification that was created by this group of people that were very worried because like a lot of people were trying to create JavaScript implementations, different vendors when the language was created, which created like not compatible websites and implementations. So to all fix this, like the whole consortium was created, and they choose this name, which I don't specifically like. But then just reading more about it, it seems that there is like this telenovela where the people that own the JavaScript brand, that I think was original from Netscape, and then if I'm not mistaken, it might be Sun Microsystems, and then I think it's Oracle right now. Please don't sue me. They don't want anyone using the name. So even for the conference, like we cannot have in the community a conference called JavaScript. So I don't know. That's what I have here. It's a quite interesting thing. The good news is that ECMAScript is here, and they have come and starting in 2015, they started releasing different specifications of the language where they created even new features that the community was looking for, which has greatly improved on the ecosystem of the community. For the class, we are going to be using ECMAScript ES 2024. So every year they create a new one, and basically we want things that are ES6 plus. But we don't really need some of the latest features, but just it's kind of like a good reference to have. Okay. Um, that's another good thing about the MDN is that for most features, they're going to tell you like what standard it supports. And that's also why I ask you all to go and take a look at documentation from the MDN, because that way you go with the specific ECMAScript implementation instead of using things from other things. So as I was telling you, you can use JavaScript in the client side, in web browsers, mobile applications, even using things like React Native or Electron apps. But you can also use it in the server side. For that, we are going to be using a specific interpreter, I think it's the best way of calling it, called Node.js. But you can also use it in Lambda functions from AWS with serverless functions or microservices and things like that. Now, speaking of the language, and again, I do have this guide and I think this could be useful, but you should go, remember, it is your requirement to go and complete the tutorials and the materials in the MDN so you can actually learn these better. So in terms of that, like for instance, for creating variables, there are three ways in which you can do that. You have var, which you shouldn't use in the class. And when you create things with var, you have things like it's okay to rename things. And also it's going to have like a functional scope and variables are going to be hoisted, which can be extremely dangerous in your code because if you're declaring variables like, I don't know, in a for loop or something like that, and you're redeclaring, then you could be modifying things that you had created before, or it can come up with a ton of different errors. So because of that, do not use var in like anymore. Instead, try using const and let const for constants, and then pretty much all the time use const unless you know that you're going to be changing the values, in which case you can go and use let. Okay. You can create different types of data. You don't have to specify what type it is because it's dynamic, which I love. You can create numbers. You don't have to say if it is an integer or a floating point. Unless you want to work with big numbers or things like that, you don't have to worry about that. You can use strings, like using single or double quotes. So you can even use back quotes for creating multi-lines and have like Claude generate some slides for that, booleans. There is a specific type called undefined or a specific value rather. I wonder if it is also that. In any case, like variables can have a value of undefined, which is the default value that they have when they don't have a value yet, okay? Which is very different from having a null value. So the null value, it's basically the variable has a value, but we don't know yet what it is, okay? But you assign that right now. So it's like or we do know what it is, and the value is null, and so we just don't want it to be like a valid one, okay? There is a more complicated one called the symbol. And the symbol, it's quite interesting because it allows you to create identifiers that are unique. Even though, and you can use it on your code, and you can reuse it and always find the variable for that specific identifier. Anyone else that even uses the same name are not going to get the same variable. So that is very useful to avoid collisions for creating libraries and things like that. As I said, you can create like larger things like big ints, and then pretty much everything else are objects. And I want to say it like even these ones are objects, but but yeah, pretty much everything in JavaScript is objects or are objects. Like even arrays, you can create arrays with these ones, or curly brackets or square brackets for arrays, or curly brackets for objects. Even functions are going to be considered objects, so that is very important to keep in mind. And then everything else. There is something else that people love making fun of JavaScript, which is the type coercion. So what happens in here is that if you take, for instance, something like a string, like in here, and then you append to that a number, then JavaScript uses a lot of wishful thinking, and then it's going to tell you, okay, so I'm assuming that you have a string, and then you wanted to keep it as a string, so this does string concatenation. Because of that, there's a lot of jokes that in JavaScript, sometimes 1 plus 1 is 11 because the first one is a string. So be very careful with that. Now, one thing that I recommend you, and please write that down, is do not use like a loose equality because that one is going to use type coercion. So number like the string with the number 5, it is going to be equal to the number 5. And unless that's what you want, just be careful and just always use triple equals, okay? Terms of falsy values, things like zero, empty string, null value, and undefined, they are all falsy values. Okay, so which means that in a conditional, um, um, they will not come as true. Okay. Now for functions, this is a fun part because in JavaScript you can create like traditional functions. You just use the function keyword, then you put the name of the function and the parameters, and then block. So like everything you already know. But you can also create functions as expressions. Okay, so when you do something like this, notice that we are not passing the name of the function in here. So this is basically like like anonymous function. And then what I'm doing is that I'm passing this as an expression. Like all of this becomes expression, and I'm just saving that on a variable, which is very powerful because then I can use that variable and pass it to another variable or pass it to a function or something like that. So I can pass functions as variables to other functions. Now, the other thing that it's important is that if you're using expressions, uh, your variables or your functions are not going to be hoisted, which means that you cannot call them before declaring the variable or the function, right? Um, which is the default behavior when you create regular function declarations. So whenever you're creating things like classes and things like that, it is common in React. It's very common to have to do things just with functions. Now, apart from that, we have something that we really like in JavaScript, which are arrow functions, and they were created also in one of these ECMAScripts specifications, which say if you start from a function expression like this, then the arrow function is just a matter of replacing the function with this arrow symbol, which is just equal and then greater than. Then you can see we have the parameters, right? Same parameters. And then the return value is what you put next to it, okay? If you only have one return value, this is very convenient because you can write a function very quickly. And since in JavaScript it's very common to pass functions as parameters, then that is extremely useful. And it's actually one of the guidelines that Cloud recommends in here coming from the MDN. So I will go with that. Now, if you have an arrow function that needs more than one instruction, then you can put blocks, and then you can see that in here, as you see in this one. Or if you only have one operator, like for instance in this case, you don't even need a parenthesis. However, you're not going to see me doing that in our code because since I use Prettier, the default for Prettiers, I just noticed teaching today another class, it's to bring always back the parentheses, which I think make things prettier. So in terms of scope and closures, I was telling my students in my other class today that this is kind of one of the most interesting and difficult concepts to understand in JavaScript, but it's one of the most powerful ones. I think this example that we have in here, it's a great way of explaining it. So maybe let's start by explaining that. We have this function called created counter, and we have a variable that it's a local variable inside that called count. So I want you to stop for a second and think, what does the create counter function returns? And you can see here is the return. So when I call that, what value do I get in counter one? Maybe pause the video or something and try to create a hypothesis. Okay, so now that you have done that, the answer is that what the value that you're returning here, some people could say it's one, maybe because I see that the count is started in zero, then I increase it in one, and then I return that count, so it could be one. But actually, instead of that, what's happening is that I'm returning another function. So the create counter creates that variable and then returns a function that has a closure on that variable. What that means is that even though this variable shouldn't exist anymore, when the function create counter ends being executed, it will still exist, and this other function is going to have access to it. So that's what's happening in here. And then in the example, this is kind of like creating two counters, two things that can count different things. And then what I can do is count one type of the type one, which gives me to one, another one of the count one, which gives me to two. And then on the other hand, I just want to start and count to one while keeping this intact. Okay. And you get that nice feature with scope and closures. So I strongly recommend you, like I was showing my other students today, came up with an idea of you can use Claude. One good way of using that, Claude or AI, is to try to help it understand different concepts. So I just sent this quick prompt where you just go and say, hey, I want you to role play as a seasoned full stack engineer, and I want you to take a look at the concepts on the MDN on closures from JavaScript. So always giving it like a reference so it knows what to study and how to test. And then I want you to ask me questions to test if I'm understanding that concept correctly. And I want you to think assume that I want to get an industry position, say for instance here in Silicon Valley. Okay. And then it say, okay, I'm going to start asking you questions, blah, blah, blah. And I just told it just remember not to tell me the answer until I tell you. And then it immediately started saying hey, how do you want to do the basic definition? So it could be an interesting experiment and you just go and answer back to that. Okay. So strongly recommend you to take a look at this concept. It's quite hard to understand. So take some time and studying that and feel free to ask us questions on Slack or coming to office hours. Okay. Now, in terms of parameters and arguments, so you have like regular when you create a function, you pass what is the name of the parameter. You don't have to say the type. Just say the value, the name in there, but you can also pass a default value. Here is one that is very interesting, and this was added in one of the later versions of ECMAScript, the specification. And basically, this is called the spread operator. And the whole idea with the spread operator is that I'm saying this function can receive multiple parameters, and then I'm going to spread them into an array that I'm going to call numbers. Okay. This one is a little bit harder to understand at this point because it's using functional programming, so I'm not going to even try to explain it really quickly. But at the very least, let me tell you what this reduce is doing. It's taking an array, and on that array, it's applying this operation when it takes a counter, okay, or an accumulator, and then it adds the current value at that starting on 0, which means that it's going to add all of them. So basically, this function is going to receive multiple parameters and then return the sum of all of them, okay? Um, so in a nutshell, what this is doing in here is like taking a function that can take multiple parameters, but then saving them on an array so I can do a dynamic operation with it, okay, regardless if it is 2 parameters, 0 parameters, or 20 parameters, okay? Then the other one that is very useful, and I actually started using a lot, is this object destructure. And it's especially useful in React, and you're going to see that later, because that way you can have props and then define specifically what are the parts of the props that you want to get. Now, basically what this is doing, and please notice the curly brackets in here, is that this is saying print user is going to accept one parameter, which is of type object. And that parameter, I'm expecting it to have an attribute name, age, and email, or 3 attributes, name, age, and email. And then basically the value of each one of those are going to be saved on these variables, which I can then go and just print with this console log. Also noticing here that I'm using this back quote, and that allows me to do these template literals, which basically replace the names in there, and then it will just show them. And then the way this is going to be used, as you can see here, print user receives one parameter, but that parameter is an object. So they put them in line in here, but it could have been saved on a different variable. So and because of that, like name is going to hold John, age is going to be 30, which is of course my age, and then this is the email for that, okay? If, for instance, you don't pass one of the attributes or the properties that is expected in here, then basically you get an undefined value in there, okay? Now, for control flow, it is easy, like not rocket science in here, so basically just regular conditionals. This is, if this evaluates true, then it goes in here, and if not, then it's going to test this other one. The only thing I have to say in here is that there is no specific else if expression. But the trick that is happening is that the else, if it doesn't have a block, then the next expression, which in this case is the if, is going to become the block for that. And because of that, like this whole block becomes the else condition. And since you have that, then, oh, sorry, actually it will be like this whole block becomes the else condition. And then since we have that if, then basically what you implement in there is like multiple options, which is the same thing that you have in here with the switch. And I also wanted to say that in my experience, I usually don't like using switches. I think it's too much code to write, but you have it in there as an option in case you want it. For error handling, you have your typical try and catch. So whatever you put in here in the block, it is going to evaluate it. If there is an exception or something like that, that is going to trigger an error that is going to be catched in here. And the specific error is going to be saved in here. You can also specify like different types of catches depending on the type of error that is generated. For the moment, this is just catching everything. And you have the finally, which is executed regardless if it is true or not. So it is great for things like closing databases, closing connections, or cleaning up things, okay? You also can throw errors, and whenever you're using throwing errors, or it's a constructor that you can use with the new operator, which kind of complicates things a lot in JavaScript, but the whole idea of what it does is that it makes a function a constructor, and then inside that constructor, there's going to be a variable, special variable named this, and that this variable is going to have is going to be initialized with an empty object, and then I can do things on that. So usually, when you're creating a constructor like that, then you just save attributes into that object. I think, like basically, one big recommendation is try not to use this whenever you're doing anything with the this operator or like expression or whatever. It tends to be more complicated code. Okay. In terms of loops, nothing fancy here. If you're coming from Java, you're going to love this one. I hate it as well as I hate Java. But basically, like your typical things, it's creating a one variable in here. Here's one example where the block scope of let is important because this I variable is only going to exist for the duration of the for loop. Then you have your typical while loops that execute the expression before running the block and then or the body. Then the do while, which does first the body and then explores the or evaluates the expression or the condition. You have your typical break and continue, and then Copilot generator, Cloud generator here, like kind of like a syntax error in here, but whatever. Basically, this is going to jump into the next iteration of the for, and this is going to break the loop at that point, regardless of the expression not being yet complete. Now, if you're coming from Python, this is especially important for you. So please pay a lot of attention to this. If you're coming from Python, do not use for in because for in JavaScript is not the same for in in Python. If you're coming from Python or another programming language that has these beautiful for in things, then use for off because that's the one that uses something very similar to that. Why? Because when the for in was created in JavaScript, it was designed to iterate through the attribute names or the property names of an object. So it's kind of like the for in, it's iterating over the properties and the for of over the values. Now, JavaScript has something that even I have been working for so long on it, learned very recently, and is that JavaScript treats arrays as objects. So because of that, if you take a look at this code, basically what we are doing is that we're creating a variable key. Notice that we are using const, even though we are kind of like changing the value. But since it is a variable that is, I guess, being created every time we iterate in this for loop, then it should be fine, I guess. In any case, the whole idea is this key is going to be iterating over A, B, and C, not the numbers, A, B, and C. And because of that, if you want to print the key and then the value, then you have to then do object, which remember is like the total object, and then sub key, okay, which kind of makes sense. It will be printing A1, B2, etc., etc. Now, if you pass an array to an for in loop, basically what is going to happen in there is that the index, so the key, the value that you have in here is going to be the index of the different elements. Because in JavaScript, arrays are just indexed structures, I think they're called. So let me search here, MDN JavaScript guide, I think it is, and then if index collection. So take a look at this. It's quite interesting, right? I found a lot of things in there for you to understand, which is going to help you understand, like explain all of these things if you want to go deep into that. Okay. Now, if you use the for of, which is basically what I do all the time, I don't use for in because I hate being confused with that. If you have an array and coming, and since I was working on Python before getting into JavaScript, basically what it does is what you expect. Like this value is going to be iterating over the X, Y, and Z in here, and that's what it is going to be printing in there. And if you have a strings, then it's going to iterate over the different characters. Okay, so apart from that, you can create objects in many different ways. So for instance, there is the regular object literal, which is the curly brackets as you saw in there. You can also put methods inside that. So pretty much it's kind of like creating like a whole object, okay? And then you can call that method as you see in here. You can also use constructor functions, which is what I was telling you before. So if you take a look at this one, and I have to change this because of the resolution is not that good on this specific slide. You can create like a function. It's going to be like a constructor. You have your parameters. And then as I said, when you use the new operator, you have this object that you can use for accessing data, okay? That is going to get initialized with an empty object, okay? Now you can also use the object create, and you can encourage you to take a look at the documentation for object. There is another one that it's like object.freeze that will allow you to create an object that cannot be changed. And then for that one, you can provide like a prototype, as you can see here. So go and take a look at that if you want more information. And then again, you can also access properties. Like once you have created a person, you can do person.name. You can modify the object after it has been created, unless it has been frozen. So yes, that's common in there. Oh, maybe one final thing is that you can also access dynamic properties. So if you want to get the email, you can just do person.property where property is available that contain the email. And then it will be like the soup with the square brackets. Then you can access that. Okay. It's quite dynamic. You want to create classes, then here you have it. You can create constructors on that. You have static methods. You can have getters, setters. There is actually like a whole new documentation on how to create those, and even I have done that for some libraries I have made. I'm not a very fond. Uh, um, um, I'm not very fond of classes in JavaScript because I think they are kind of like not that useful, and it makes me write so much code. So I just prefer creating objects directly. Okay, but you do you. So in terms of modern options, you have these template literals, and the template literals are going to be this idea where, for instance, if you want to create something that says, hello, my name is, and then have the name John, and I am years old, and of course, this is my age. Then one way you can do it with in ES6 plus, it's template literals. So basically use back quote. Please be aware it's the back one. There is three types, like straight forward and then back. And then I'm saying insert in this part, notice the dollar sign and curly brackets. So insert in there the name, as you can see in there. That's quite useful. It's also very useful for creating multi-line strings without having to say \n or whatever. And you can even go and create your own specific template. So you're going to say highlight this thing, and then you spell this text. And then you do that by creating a function as you see in here, and then you do whatever you want to do in there. In this case, like for instance, highlighting or something like that. Okay. This structure is very useful. It's one of the latest features, and I strongly recommend you take a lot of attention to it. Here is an example on how it works. I think it might have been like the JavaScript community got inspired from Python. But if you have an array with 5 positions, like in here, right? And then I'm saying I want to create 3 variables, first, second, and rest. And I'm getting that the structure in the array, okay, RR array. So if you do that and you take a look at that, what we'll be getting in the first variable is going to be 1. In the second one, you're going to get second. And since we are using the spread operator, in this context, it means the rest or the remaining. So rest is going to be 1 variable with the 3, 4, 5 array, okay, which is the rest. You can also use this nice trick for swapping variables. So if you have A and B, then you can say AB is BA, and that's it. And the other one that is very useful, it's using object structuring, as you can see in here. If you create an object, and I already told you an example is very similar to that. If I take this user and then put it in here, then it is going to put the John in the name, blah, 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 and age 30, and then the email. You can also use aliases. So for instance, I want to get the name and then save it as username. Or you can have defaults in case, like for instance, the city is not a part of the attributes of this user. So it's going just to put unknown in there. Okay. You can use the spread operator, as I was telling you. It is very useful, for instance, if you have 2 arrays and you want to concatenate them into another one, then you can just go and say create a new array, and then the first part, spread the first array, and then spread the second array. You can do the same thing with objects. So spread the first object and the second, and then you get an object that contains all the attributes of the 2 of them. If the second object contains an attribute that already exists in the previous one, I think it will override it. So be aware of that. Okay. You can also use it for function calls. So if you want to call a function that takes only like that takes many parameters, and you have an array, and you want those to be spread, that's why it's called spread. You just do like spread numbers, and then basically that is going to call max as if I had called max with 1, 2, 3 instead of one parameter containing the first array. Hope that's clear. Now, the other thing is the rest parameters. I already explained this one, so that should be fine. But basically, it's a function, and then all of the parameters are going to be saved into just one array. Or you can say save the first one, and then everything else save it in here. Okay. Uh, for promises and async, this is a little bit more complicated, and we probably are going to be talking more about that. But the whole idea with a promise is that it allows you to create a synchronous code. JavaScript is special in that sense, that it is designed to execute a lot of functions and a lot of things at the same time, but by having a single thread. And the way you do that is that instead of waiting for things to finish, then it will schedule the execution of that and then wait until it has time to run it. So promises is a very nice syntactic sugar that allows me to do something like create this promise code that will fetch an user, fetch the first user, and then when I get a response for that, if I get the user, then print it in the console. But you can also sync and await, which actually makes that look even better. I can go and say get user, and then I can go on and say await while I get the user, and then that is going to be saved in here, which is extremely useful. I'm going to try to give you more examples of that so you can see that, but then also you can do things like this one where I'm waiting for multiple things. So we can talk more about promises in a while. Meanwhile, something very important, please write this down. In this class, you can only use ES6 modules, and it's a good practice. Like this is a new standard that is trying to unify the way we import and export files on JavaScript. So whenever you want to export something in your file, like in this case in the mat.js file, you just go and say you just go and say export and that thing. You can export functions and variables and classes and things like that. Okay. You can also go and say, I want to export like this specific object in here. Okay. And then on the one that you are importing from, then you can go and say, I want to import this specific one. Like this is the default. Basically, it's going to be this one. And I'm going to save it in here. Or you can import specific elements, like in this case, pi or the add function, which I'm getting from this. Okay. So those are the ones that you put into the curly brackets. Again, remember, it is very important that you go and learn about these things on the MDN. And if you have questions, you let us know. Okay. So for collections and other data structures, we are going to be talking more about this probably also later, but for the moment it is very important that you understand that JavaScript is a functional programming language. So you have a lot of functions for arrays. So you have this array. You can do things like a map, which is going to execute this for each one of those numbers and then return another array containing those. Like for instance, if these are the numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and since what I'm doing is duplicating them, that is going to create another array that contains 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Filter is also extremely commonly used. And then I'm saying, please take a look at the original numbers that I have in here and only returns those whose value is greater than 3. So you get 4 and 5. And then you have the reduce that I showed you before, which is a little bit more complicated. It accepts two parameters. The first one is a function that takes two parameters, which is an accumulator and the current value. It actually can take more. So you can take, like, for instance, current value and then the index. In this case, for instance, it's saying, I'm going to take an accumulator, which, by the way, starts on 0, and then take that accumulator and sum the current value. So it's going to be 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. You can also have find or find by index. You can check if some things complete that. You can also modify array using things like push or shift or unshift or splice. Slice is also very commonly used. Just go and take a look at the documentation. Remember, every time you want to look for something, um, just go and search on MDN, and you're going to get a lot of different functions for this. So that's why I recommend you this, so you can go and learn on your own pace or at your own pace. There are new methods or new data structures that were created that you can use on JavaScript as well that actually made some libraries obsolete. Some of those are things like the set, which makes sure that you only have one value of each and not duplicates. You have maps, which are going to be similar to you coming from Java to your hash map or something like that. And basically, it's kind of like setting like a key with a value. You could argue that you can do that with objects, but then the problem is that objects have some other extra attributes, and then if you want to have very particular types of keys, then you definitely want to be using maps. So be aware of that. And from practical examples, here is a very nice example that cloud extract from MDN. And then basically what this is doing is that you see this button in here. If you want to see the code that is generating that, always right click and inspect. And then now you can see that we have a button whose ID is button example. Now in seeing that, then you can come in JavaScript and then using a specific global variable called document, which is the DOM API. And then again, as usual, MDN DOM API or whatever. Then that takes you to this documentation, and then you can read all about these things, especially these examples, blah, blah, blah. You have some methods, and here basically I'm using one of my favorites, which is query selector. And the cool thing about query selector on the DOM is that I can go and select anything using a CSS selector. In this case, button example. Remember, we have the ID, so it's hashtag button example. That will get me an element, which is this button, and I'm repeating the same thing for an output, which is another element that is right, I think, above it. And then I create a count. And then on the button, I create an event listener that says every time I click on the button, I want you to call this function. And notice that I have an arrow function in there. And what the arrow function does is that it increments the count. And then in the HTML for the output, it is going to put click times. And then I can just go and click multiple times on that. Oops, yes. So nice little example. Fetch, it's a very useful interface that also made many libraries obsolete. And you can go and request like resources. Like for instance, usually these resources are going to be in JSON format or something like that. So basically I go and say, get me that resource. If the response is correct, if it is not correct, and this is a very common pattern in JavaScript, instead of saying if it is correct, you say if it is not, then break. And then if it is correct, then I just convert that into JSON, and notice that we are using a couple of waits because those are promises. So that way I don't have to create like a callback hell, which will be just putting in the inner values in there as well. So this is for how to load some JSON data. And then for best practices, you can use const by default, and then let for reassigning, do not use var. Arrow functions for callbacks is extremely useful, so that way you don't have to write that much. Definitely use async and wait over then chains. And then always handle errors, like use try and catch. And then finally, don't forget that one as well, the strict equality, triple equals. Trying to keep your functions small and focused. So it is very useful when you actually develop JavaScript that way. And then make sure to use meaningful variables and function names and leverage the modern ESCs features that we have seen. Okay, so some common patterns in here. I invite you to take a look at that. This is one common one that I actually don't use that much, but basically it's creating like an expression function and then calling it right away. Like also observers, something like that. So I'm going to skip on that. Okay, so I think this is the final one that Claude generated in there, and it's just saying that JavaScript is quite powerful right now, and then you can use different frameworks. We are going to be using React. I prefer Svelte, but students love React, so we go with that. We're going to be using this Vite or Beat building tool for testing. We might use a little bit of Cypress. As I mentioned, you can use TypeScript if you are more into structured things. Node.js for the backend, and then there are some other advanced topics that hopefully we are going to have time to cover, which makes our website even more interesting. Okay, so if you want to learn more, here is a bunch of resources that Claude summarized in there, so you have access to the slides, so you can see them in there. So with that, here is a final summary that I have on JavaScript and the many features it has, and I hope this video doesn't get broken or corrupted in any way. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much, and let us know in Slack or even here in the comments if you have any questions. Thank you.